The plateau had been cold for longer than any recorded civilization had existed. That was the first thing they taught us at the garrison, not tactics, not orbital mechanics, not the frequency tables or the archive's 12,000 indexed entries. The first thing was the cold. They brought you out to the eastern parapet at dawn on your second day, when the wind came off the highlands and the ice fields on the high ridges caught the early light, and a senior officer stood beside you and said, "Imagine this world at its deepest freeze. Imagine the glaciers reaching the coast. Imagine your people scattered in tens of thousands, cold and thin and afraid, looking up at a sky they couldn't explain." That was what the Keth Ascendancy found when they first came. That was what they expected to find again. I had been posted to the Tareth garrison for 11 years when the contact signal arrived. I was 41 years old, a ground commander in the Framework's Continuity Defense Division, assigned to the forward position above the Anatolian megacity. My name is Sira Voss. My grandmother's grandmother had been a cataloging archivist in the Archive's 7th Regional Division, the one that worked the oral tradition files, the oldest material, the accounts that had been passed from speaker to speaker for 10,000 years before anyone thought to write them down. She used to say that her work was translation, not from language to language, but from memory to record. Taking what the long-ago people had held in their minds through generations of careful repetition, and making it something the archive could keep forever. I thought about that a great deal in the days before the Keth arrived. I thought about those early archivists bent over their tablets, reconstructing accounts of figures in the sky, of lights that descended in the glacial dark, of people who were taken and did not return. I thought about how long the chain had been, how many hands had passed the memory forward before anyone in authority believed it was real rather than mythology, and how many more years had passed between belief and documentation, between documentation and verification, between verification and the first formal claim filed in the Galactic Continuity Framework. The claim had been filed 407 years before the Keth arrived. I knew the exact number because it was logged in the archive, which logged everything, and because I had read it the morning the contact signal came in. I read it the way a soldier checks a weapon before an operation, not because I doubted it was there, but because the ritual of reading it steadied me. The contact signal was unmistakable. The frequency analysts at Kethai's station had been monitoring for it for 70 years, cross-referencing against the oldest entries in the archive, and when it arrived, they recognized it immediately. Not because they had heard it before no living person had, but because they had studied it for their entire careers. The signal was a tribute commencement protocol. It was the Keth Ascendancy's standard opening transmission when they identified a viable harvest world. They had broadcasted on the same carrier frequency in every recorded contact going back 200,000 years, and the archive had the original recordings from the glacial era preserved in 3 redundant vaults. It was, in the technical sense, a legal document, a formal statement of intent. In the Keth's own register, a hierarchical address system built around biological dominance cues, it translated to something approximately equivalent to: the Ascendancy recognizes this world as a tributary resource in active harvest status, tribute collection cycle now commencing, registered harvestable population to present at designated landing coordinates for assessment and allocation. The Framework Translation Division had confirmed that rendering 412 years ago, when the claim was being prepared. The Keth did not know that. They did not know that every word of their own legal language had been systematically decoded over 3 centuries by a division of linguists who had nothing to study but the recordings in the archive, and who had produced, over those centuries, the most comprehensive analysis of Keth tributary law ever assembled, by anyone, anywhere. They did not know that the claim filed in the Framework's registry was drafted in technically correct Keth hierarchical address, citing violations of the Framework's founding charter by chapter and subsection, and that it had been sitting in the Framework's legal queue, acknowledged, logged, and assigned a docket number for 407 years. They did not know any of that because they had not been here to see it being built. 200,000 years is a long time to prepare. Let me try to tell you something about the archive, because the word alone does not carry what the archive actually was. It was not a database, or rather, it was a database in the same way that a river is water, technically accurate, practically insufficient. The archive had begun as a collection of oral tradition recordings. The oldest material in it dated to approximately 190,000 years ago, which was roughly 10,000 years after the last confirmed Keth contact, and it had been started by a division head named Keth Perrin. The coincidence of the name and the threat's name was noted in the founding records, and it had made her uncomfortable. She wrote in her personal log, though she had not let it slow her. She had spent 40 years building the oral tradition collection, traveling to every settled community on Earth that had any preserved oral literature from the glacial era, and she had found, in the accounts of dozens of separate cultures with no contact with one another, the same recurring elements. Figures in the sky, lights that descended in the dark, a humming that you felt in your bones, people who were taken and did not return. No mythology she knew repeated independently across isolated cultures without a real event at its root. She had written that principle into the founding brief of the archive, in terms blunt enough to survive 100,000 years of institutional succession. The accounts describe a real event. The accounts describe a real entity. We do not know when it will happen again. The correct response to a real threat is preparation, and we have as long as it takes. After Keth Perrin, the archive had been led by 43 successive directors over 180,000 years. Some of them had been brilliant, and some of them had been competent, and one of them in the records was described with enough diplomatic circumspection to suggest she had been neither, but the chain had held. The archive had survived institutional reorganizations, political pressures to defund what several governing bodies at various points in history had characterized as a speculative defense investment with no confirmed threat timetable, budget crises, the loss of 2 regional vaults to natural disaster, and once, a fire that destroyed 11 years of oral tradition translation work, and was the only time in the archive's recorded history that a director had written in the official log something that was not a formal institutional statement. Director Peth Varath had written, "I am very tired. We will rebuild. We will not stop." They had rebuilt. They had not stopped. The translation division had begun its work on the Keth legal register approximately 350 years ago, when enough acoustic material from the glacial-era recordings had been cleaned and analyzed to make systematic linguistic decoding possible. The lead linguist on the founding team, a woman named Asha Ren, had described the early years of the project as something like learning to read by looking at shadows. The recordings were incomplete, heavily degraded, filtered through the perceptual limitations of people who had been afraid and cold and had no framework for what they were hearing. But there was enough. There was always enough, if you were patient enough to find it. Ren had taught herself to recognize the phonemic system. Her students had built the first grammatical model. Their students had decoded the hierarchical address register, which turned out to be the key. The Keth's legal language was the same as their social language, only more formalized, and once you understood that their entire communication system was organized around dominance gradients, the legal documents embedded in the glacial-era recordings became legible. It had taken 119 years from Ren's first phonemic map to a complete working translation of the oldest recordings. Another 40 years to produce a framework standard translation certified for legal use. The legal division had then spent 40 years drafting the claim, because the claim had to be perfect, not serviceable, not adequate, perfect, and getting it perfect in the Keth's own formal register had required that level of care. 407 years ago, the claim had been filed. The framework's docket clerks had acknowledged it, assigned it a case number, and noted in their internal log that it was the oldest claim in their active queue by approximately 169,000 years. The framework had frameworks for this kind of thing, which was part of why Earth had spent 80,000 years building the framework in the first place. The other reasons were their own stories, logged in the archive, and I will not recount all of them here. The Keth ascendancy entered the atmosphere in the second week of spring. I was at the garrison wall when the first vessels came through. The wall runs along the eastern ridge of the Tareth Plateau, 3,000 meters above sea level, and on a clear day you can see the megacity spreading across the basin below, the towers, the transit lines, the orbital tether at the city's center climbing out of sight, the ring itself crossing the midday sky like a pale arc of hammered metal. The ring is the most visible thing on Earth from a distance of 1,000 kilometers. It is not the most formidable thing humanity has built, but it is the most visible, and that was intentional. The Keth formation descended in a pattern, the archive identified instantly. The garrison's tactical AI, a distributed system called the Tareth Identification Archive, the archive for short, though it was far more than a repository, had been running the comparison since the contact signal came in. By the time the first vessels were visible from the wall, it had matched the formation geometry to landing pattern index 7 in the glacial era records, a wide dispersal approach designed to prevent a surrounded prey population from routing to escape in any direction. A hunting formation, a formation designed for a world where the prey ran. There were approximately 2 million Keth warriors in the formation. This was consistent with their historical tribute collection deployments. Their records, which the archive had partially reconstructed from the oral tradition accounts, supplemented by material recovered during the framework's Keth contact research phase, suggested that a standard collection deployment was calibrated to outnumber the identified prey population by a factor of at least 20. 200,000 years ago, the human population of this region had been scattered and small. 20 to 1 had been conservative. They had not updated the calculation. I watched the vessels come down. There is something I want to say about this moment that is difficult to put into words, and I have spent a great deal of time since then trying to find them. There is a kind of clarity that comes in the seconds before an authorized action, when everything has been prepared, and everything has been checked, and the only thing remaining is execution. Not calm exactly, because calm implies the absence of feeling, and what I felt was not absence but presence. The weight of the long work, the chain of hands from the oral tradition archivists to my grandmother's grandmother to the translators, to the legal division to the framework's docket clerks to the 407 years of waiting, all of it resting in the moment before it was used. The archive's voice came through my headset, even and precise. Keth formation has achieved full atmospheric insertion. Landing pattern index 7 confirmed. Vessel count 12,411. Estimated disembarkation 90 minutes. Tribute assessment scan activation predicted at plus 108 minutes from now. I said acknowledged. There was a pause, and then the archive said, "The Framework War Crimes docket confirms our authorization window opens at disembarkation plus 72 hours, conditioned on the tribute assessment scan activation. Once they activate the scan, the precondition is met, and the window opens immediately." "Understood," I said. "Stand by." I watched the vessels touch down on the plateau below the ridge. The Keth do not land gently. Their vessels are heavy-armored transport craft, built for hostile environment insertions, and they come down hard, raising dust and burning the ground beneath their landing struts. 12,411 of them, spread across the plateau, was something like a second landscape appearing under the first, a city of metal, gray-brown in the spring light, engines winding down in sequence. The garrison had been in pre-authorization alert posture for 3 weeks. Not high alert, not the kind of posture that strains a force and frays attention by the end of the second week. Low and sustained, the way the archive's operational protocols specified for long-anticipated events. Systems pre-positioned, authorization codes distributed, personnel briefed to their specific roles. No extraordinary deviation from normal garrison routine except the things that needed to be different. The mess hall ran on normal schedule. Watch rotations ran on normal schedule. Equipment checks ran at the elevated frequency that the protocol specified, but they were systematic and calm. Preparation that is worth anything is designed to be sustainable, because you never know exactly when the thing you prepared for will arrive. And a force that has burned itself out waiting is no better than a force that never prepared at all. My second in command, a senior lieutenant named Orcs, who had been at the garrison for 7 years before my posting and who knew the case docket better than anyone except the archive itself, had told the section leaders at the first pre-authorization briefing, "We do not know the exact day. We know the window. We hold the window. Do your jobs. When the signal comes, we will be ready because we have already been ready. The moment of the signal is not the beginning of the preparation. It is the confirmation that the preparation was correct." He was right. When the signal came, we were ready. There was no scramble, no unexpected discovery, no element that had not been planned for. The 3-week alert posture had been the last phase of a 400-year-old plan, and the plan had been thorough. I had studied their biology in the archive's xenology files. The Keth are bipedal, roughly 2 meters tall, with a triple-jointed limb structure that makes their movement appear wrong to human eyes, not threatening, exactly, but subtly incorrect, like a familiar shape rendered at a fractional misalignment. Their armor is a hardened resin secreted from glands along their thorax, grown into plates that they reinforce over decades. Their weapons are conducted energy devices, scaled to produce effects appropriate for incapacitating unarmored biological targets, prey. The weapons had not changed in the archive's records. 200,000 years, and the weapons designed for frightened, scattered, Ice Age humanity had not been upgraded. They had not needed to be. The prey they expected had not changed either, as far as they knew. There were officers in my garrison who found that fact infuriating. There were some who found it satisfying, the way you find it satisfying when an adversary's complacency becomes structural. I found it neither. I found it sad, in the way that most tremendous failures of intelligence are sad, not in the sense of sorrowful, but in the sense of a waste. 200,000 years of history had passed on this world. Empires had risen and ended. Civilizations had built things that still stood. A species had gone from scattered camps in the glacial dark to a ring in orbit, 40,000 warships, 11 billion people, a legal architecture that spanned the known galaxy. And the Keth had not known any of it because they had not thought to look. They had not thought to look because they did not believe the prey could have become anything worth looking at. The first warriors emerged from the lead vessels 91 minutes after touchdown. The formation was orderly, precise, and completely consistent with the archive's Index 7 protocol, the deployment pattern for a standard tribute extraction operation on a low-resistance world. 2 million warriors forming up on the Tarath Plateau, facing outward in a hemisphere, the tribute assessment equipment already being unloaded from the cargo bays. The equipment was the critical piece. The assessment scan was what the archive had been waiting for, what the framework's precondition clause required, what would open the authorization window. I had been told in my briefings that the assessment scan was a biological inventory system. It mapped and categorized biological signatures across a wide radius, separating them by species, approximate health status, and what the Keth's own documentation described as utility index, an evaluation of which prey individuals were most suitable for which purposes. 200,000 years ago, the scan had been used to sort the people of the Ice Age world into categories: those who would be taken as tribute, those who were not worth the transport weight, those who were left behind. The archive had accounts from the oral tradition of people who remembered the scan as a light that passed through the air, a humming that you could feel in your bones, a moment of being looked at by something that did not see you as a person. Every person who had survived that scan, everyone who had been left behind, who had watched family members and companions selected and taken and never returned, had passed their account down through the generations. Every account that had survived to be captured by the archivists was in the archive. Every name that had been preserved, every description of the vessels, every detail of the warrior's appearance, every recording of the sounds they made. The archive had remembered every face it had ever been told about. That was the archive's founding mandate, written into the brief by Keth Perrin 182,000 years ago and never amended. Remember every face. Preserve every account. Do not let the record go incomplete. The people who were taken deserved to be remembered, and the record of what was done to them would be the foundation of the claim when the time came. When the tribute assessment scan activated, I felt it the way the old accounts described, a humming, a pressure in the air, a sense of being looked at. The scan was a broad-spectrum biological survey pulse, and it swept the plateau and the basin below, and the megacity and the orbital tether and the sky above. What it found was not what its calibration expected. The Keth's assessment system was designed to process a certain profile, scattered biological signatures, low density, high fear response index, minimal coordination, no energy infrastructure above thermal and chemical combustion. The profile it had been programmed with was, in essence, a picture of Earth 200,000 years ago. The system encountered instead 11 billion biological signatures in high-density, concentrated nodes, vast energy infrastructure spiking across every spectrum, coordinated response patterns consistent with a unified defense posture, and above the atmosphere, the ring. The scan also triggered the archive's response protocol. This was the part that had taken the longest to build. The assessment scan was, in the Keth's own legal register, a formal act of tribute commencement. The moment it activated, they had initiated their legal claim process. Under the framework's charter, that made them an active party in the pre-filed war crimes claim, which meant they were entitled, and under framework procedure, required to receive a full formal response on record. The archive transmitted that response in the scan's own frequency, in technically correct Keth hierarchical address, in the highest formal register the language possessed. The transmission ran for 3 minutes and 47 seconds. I had read the full text during my preparation period. I had read it so many times I could follow it in the original Keth address, which is a thing I have never been asked to do since and will probably never be asked to do again. It contained the complete war crimes claim, every documented tribute collection from the glacial era, cross-referenced and indexed by location, time, estimated population impact, and category of harm. It contained the oral tradition accounts, translated into Keth hierarchical address. It contained the biological survey data from the archive's population records going back 180,000 years, demonstrating continuous sapient presence and development on the planet the Keth had classified as a tributary resource. It contained the framework founding charter provisions the Keth had violated, cited by article and subsection. It contained the names, every name preserved in the archive from the oral tradition accounts, the people who had been taken and not returned, 3,412 individual names, reconstructed over the course of the archival project from accounts given in 7 different languages and 17 regional dialects, and spanning approximately 6,000 years of collection events. 3,412 names, read into the record in the Keth's highest formal register, the one reserved for evidence of consequence in legal proceedings. It contained at the end in the same high formal register the framework authorization confirmation, case docket 47,912, pre-authorized enforcement action, window opened, authorized party Earth Continuity Defense Division, Ground Command Tareth Garrison, Commander Sira Voss, Authorization code confirmed. I had read the authorization code that morning when I checked the weapon. There was a silence on the Keth command frequencies after the transmission ended. The archive was monitoring them, and I could hear it in my headset, not the words, because the Keth command language was a different register from their legal address, faster and more compressed, and the translation took time, but the quality of the sound. There is a particular quality to the communications of a force that has just received information it was not prepared to receive, and it does not matter what species is speaking or what language they use. It sounds the same. It sounds like the moment before reorientation, when the incoming data is too large to process quickly, and the processing pause fills the channel. The Keth command channel was silent for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Then their formation began to change. It was not an organized withdrawal. I want to be clear about that, because there is a version of this story that is told as though the Keth, confronted with evidence of their crimes and the legal authorization for enforcement action, made a rational decision and attempted to comply with due process. That is not what happened. What happened was that the tribute assessment scan had returned a picture of Earth that the Keth's military command had not planned for, and the archive's transmission had told them that the force they were facing was not the prey they had come to collect, and the 4-minute silence was the command chain trying to reconcile those two facts with the deployment they were already committed to. When the formation changed, it changed toward a combat posture, not retreat combat toward us. I had been told this was the most likely outcome, and I had understood it intellectually, but there is a difference between understanding a thing and seeing 2 million warriors in a combat formation pivoting toward your position. The weapons they carried had been designed to incapacitate prey. The formation they adopted, the archive identified it from the glacial era records within 11 seconds of the shift beginning, was a mass advance pattern, designed to overwhelm a dispersed prey population through sheer forward pressure. It was the same formation they had used when the oral tradition accounts described the taking, the same formation they had used when the people in the camps had looked up and had no way to stop what was coming. They were so certain of what they remembered that they did not look at what was in front of them. I stood at the garrison wall for a moment that felt longer than it was, watching the movement, and then I keyed the command circuit and said, "Archive, confirm authorization." The archive said, "Authorization confirmed. Case docket 47,912. All preconditions met. Authorization window open. Recommend immediate execution." I said, "Execute." What follows is a matter of record, and the record is complete because the archive logs everything. The ring is not primarily a defense installation. It is infrastructure, transit, manufacturing, power relay, a dozen categories of function that keep 11 billion people supplied and connected. But infrastructure of that scale, in orbit, with that mass and that power throughput, has inherent capabilities that are simply a consequence of what it is, and the defense applications were understood and planned for from the earliest design phases. The ring's primary kinetic arrays, not the weapons, just the mass drivers used for orbital logistics, modified to point downward, had been prepositioned in the authorization profile for case docket 47,912 for 11 years, updated quarterly as the Keth's trajectory refined. The trajectory had been calculated from the carrier frequency's vector analysis, and it had been right. Earth's registered warship count at the time of the Keth landing was 41,712. This did not include reserve vessels, system defense platforms, or the garrison's own embedded assets. Of the registered warships, approximately 9,000 were within rapid response range of the Tarath Plateau. They had been in that position for 3 weeks, repositioned under the routine training exercise cover designation that the framework used for pre-authorization prepositioning. The Keth had not known to look for that either. The Keth formation had 2 million warriors and 12,411 vessels, designed for a harvest world with a scattered prey population. The arithmetic was not favorable to the Keth. I did not watch the entire engagement from the wall. After the first minute, there was nothing to see that required watching. The engagement was not the kind that needs a ground commander's eyes on it, because the ground was largely irrelevant. The Keth had not understood that their combat formation, designed for fighting prey, was deployed on the surface of a world that had spent 190,000 years building things that operated primarily above the surface. Their formation did not have a meaningful counter to what came down through the atmosphere from above. The conducted energy weapons designed to incapacitate unarmored biological targets had, as their upper calibration threshold, the ability to neutralize an armored human soldier at close range. They had not been calibrated for orbital kinetic impacts or warship-scale energy discharge, because the combat doctrine that had produced them had never contemplated facing either. It was over in 11 minutes. I walked the wall while it happened. Not away, I did not leave the wall, but along it back and forth, the way I do when I am thinking. I have been asked since whether I felt anything during those 11 minutes, and I have always found the question difficult to answer honestly. I felt the weight of it. Not satisfaction, that word does not fit what this was. Not grief, though grief was somewhere underneath. What I felt was closer to completion. The way a very long project feels when the last piece falls into place, not with a crash, but with a quiet and final click. I thought about the oral tradition archivists. I thought about the early catalogers who had spent careers trying to determine whether the accounts were mythological or evidential, and about the point, which the archive had logged precisely, in the records of a senior division head named Keth Perrin, who had worked in the oral tradition division for 40 years. When the weight of internal consistency across tens of thousands of independent accounts had become too great to explain as mythology. That log entry was dated 182,000 years ago. Keth Perrin had written, "The accounts describe a real event. The accounts describe a real entity. The accounts describe a repeating pattern of visitation, assessment, selection, and removal. We do not yet know when it will happen again. We do not yet know from where, but the correct response to a real threat is preparation, and we have as long as it takes." She had not known it would take 200,000 years, but she had written, "as long as it takes," and every archivist and analyst and translator and legal scholar who had followed her had treated that as the operating brief. The archive's final count on the Keth engagement, 11 minutes, 23 seconds from my authorization to the last Keth vessel disabled or destroyed. 0 return fire reached the garrison perimeter. 0 framework civilian casualties. 0 warships lost. The Keth's combat posture had been built for prey that ran. It did not include a meaningful doctrine for a target that fired back from orbit with 41,000 registered warships and a planetary ring. I walked back to the center of the wall when the engagement timer in my headset stopped. The plateau below was different than it had been. Not the way battlefields usually look, with the evidence of human effort and loss in both directions. More like the aftermath of a geological event, the kind of sudden geological event that happens when an orbital kinetic array and 9,000 warships are given 11 minutes of authorization. The Keth formation had occupied a significant portion of the plateau, and the authorized response had not been calibrated for minimum footprint. It had been calibrated for complete and permanent cessation of the threat, as the docket required when a force activated a tribute collection posture against a framework member world. I thought about the word hunt and what it meant in the oral tradition accounts. The people of the Ice Age world had not had a word for what the Keth were because they had not had context for what the Keth were. They had described them as hunters, figures that came out of the sky and moved through the camps and took people, not soldiers, because the people of the Ice Age world did not have soldiers in the sense we mean. Hunters. The Keth had come back to hunt. They had not understood that the prey had spent 200,000 years becoming something else. I keyed the archive's documentation channel. This was a formal step, required by the framework's post-authorization reporting procedure, and it had to be done by the authorizing ground commander within 2 hours of engagement closure. The archive was already compiling the engagement record. It always was. It logged everything. But the formal closing statement had to come from me. I said, "This is Commander Sira Voss, Tareth Garrison, Continuity Defense Division, Earth Sovereignty Framework. Case docket 47,912, authorized enforcement action, engagement concluded. Time of final cessation, confirmed by archive timestamp. Pre-authorized action executed within authorization parameters. No deviations from framework enforcement protocol. Engagement record complete." The 3,412 names in the case record are acknowledged as the foundation of this action, and the action is dedicated to their memory. That last sentence was not required by procedure. I added it because it was true. The archive said, "Statement received and logged. Case docket 47,912 marked closed. Would you like to add a personal notation?" This was not a standard part of the procedure. The archive sometimes asked. It had a record of ground commanders adding personal notations at the close of significant engagements, and its heuristics identified this as a significant engagement. I did not know whether I wanted to add one. I stood at the wall for a moment, looking at the plateau and the megacity below, and the orbital tether climbing into the spring sky and the ring. I thought about Keth Perrin's log entry. The correct response to a real threat is preparation, and we have as long as it takes. I thought about the oral tradition accounts, the people standing in the camps in the glacial dark, looking up at the lights descending, the humming in the bones, the moment of being looked at by something that did not see them as people. I thought about what they had done after, not what they had been through. I had read the accounts. I knew what they had been through. What I thought about was what they had done in the aftermath, the ones who survived, who came through the glacial maximum and the tribute collections and the taking, and who looked up at the same sky and passed the memory forward, who said, in the words the oral tradition archivists had later reconstructed and translated, "Remember what came. Remember what it did. Remember every face. We do not know yet how to prevent the next time. But we will learn, and our children will learn further and their children after them. We have as long as it takes." They had given us as long as it took. I said, "Archive, add a personal notation." Notation text, "They came back for the frightened ones. We were not frightened. We had not been frightened for a very long time. We had been working." End notation. The archive said, "Notation added and logged." I put my hands on the wall and looked out across the plateau. The spring sky was the same sky it had always been. The ring crossed it in a pale arc. The megacity hummed below. The orbital tether caught the afternoon light. 3,000 meters above the Anatolian basin, on a plateau that had once been an ice-covered highland above scattered camps of cold and exhausted people who had watched figures take their families, and had not known what they were or how to stop them. The wind came in off the high ridges, and it was clean and cold, and it smelled like stone. My relief arrived at the appointed hour, as always. I gave him the standard end-of-watch briefing. Garrison status, no anomalies post-engagement, archive operational, ring transit nominal, all systems green. He was a young officer, 26, 2 years at the garrison, and he was trying not to look too long at the plateau below the wall. I understood the impulse. The first time you see what the ring can do at close range, it takes a moment to absorb the scale of what you are actually part of. I told him it was all in the archive, if he wanted to understand it, every step of how it had been built to that conclusion. He should read the founding entries from Keth Perrin, and the oral tradition collection logs, and the framework claim preparation records, and the translation division reports, and the xenology files on the Keth, and the legal division's 40-year drafting history. He should understand what had been built and why and who had built it, because understanding the chain was the only way to be a proper part of it. You could not serve the preparation without knowing the preparation. That was the garrison's first teaching, underneath even the teaching about the cold. "How long did you know this was coming?" he asked. I thought about that. Not about the specific answer. I had known for the 11 years of my posting, and the posting notice had included the full case docket briefing, and I had read it on my first day at the garrison, the way you read your orders. But he was asking something larger than that. 407 years since the docket was filed, I said. 190,000 years since Keth Perrin wrote the founding brief. 200,000 years since the people they came back for first looked up and decided their children needed to know. He stood quietly with that for a moment, which was the right response. "Go ahead and read the archive," I said. "Start with the oldest material, the oral tradition files. It takes a while to read all of it." "It's supposed to." I left him at the wall and went down through the garrison to the duty room, and I wrote the formal post-engagement report in the archive's standard template and filed it through the framework channel. The framework's acknowledgement came back in 11 minutes, confirming receipt, confirming the case docket closed, confirming the engagement record archived permanently under the Foundation Files category, which was the framework's designation for documents of historical significance to be maintained in perpetuity. Foundation Files. I thought the designation was right. I also thought about the 3,412 names, and what it had meant to say them aloud into the Keth's highest formal register during the transmission. Not as accusation, not as performance, as record, as the thing the archive had been built to preserve, and the thing the legal claim had been built to present. They were in the record now, in the framework's permanent archive, cited as the foundation of an authorized enforcement action. They would not be unmade from it. Outside the duty room window, the Anatolian megacity was doing what cities do in the late afternoon, lights beginning to come on in the towers, transit lines moving, the orbital tether bright at its upper reach, the ring overhead catching the last of the long spring light. The same plateau, the same sky. A world that had been one thing once and had refused to stay that way, had refused quietly and persistently, and without announcement for 200,000 years, building toward a moment that the people who began the building could not have lived to see. Most people in the megacity had not read the civil defense notice carefully. The public information line's volume had stayed normal all day. People had work to do. People had lives to live. People had been building those lives for generations on a world that had also been, for the same generations, quietly and completely preparing for this. The preparation did not interrupt daily life. It ran underneath everything else, patient and thorough, funded and continued through every political era and every budget cycle and every governing body that had been tempted to call it speculative. It ran because there had always been enough people who understood what Keth Perrin had written. The correct response to a real threat is preparation, not reaction, not improvisation, not scrappy last-minute brilliance. Preparation. I filed the report, and I sat for a moment in the quiet of the duty room, and I thought about the cold of the long ice. I thought about the people who had looked up and decided to pass the memory forward. I thought about what it meant to be the generation that finally got to write the closing entry. Then I went to the archive terminal and I looked up Keth Perrin's original founding brief from 182,000 years ago, and I read the last line again. The correct response to a real threat is preparation, and we have as long as it takes. We had taken exactly as long as it took. Not 1 year more, not 1 year less. The archive kept the record. The record was complete. I want to go back and tell you something I skipped over, because it matters to the shape of the story, and I have told it too quickly. The week before the contact signal arrived, the garrison ran its final pre-authorization review. This was a procedural requirement for any authorized enforcement action under the framework's Chapter 9 provisions, and it meant that every officer in the chain of command, from me down to the watch section leaders, and upward through the Continuity Defense Division chain to the framework's authorization panel, reviewed the case docket, the authorization parameters, the engagement plan, and the post-action reporting requirements. The review had to be signed and logged. It had to be complete. No shortcuts, no delegation, no proxy signatures. I had done the review 4 times before. Once when I first arrived at the garrison as part of my initial posting briefing. Once at the 5-year mark, as required by the Standing Order rotation schedule. Once when the Keth's trajectory was first calculated with sufficient precision to assign a probable arrival window. And once now, the week before the signal arrived, when the trajectory had been refined to a certainty. The review took 9 days. The case docket was not short. It was not short because the archive was not short. 182,000 years of institutional memory, organized into legal citation format, with supporting documentation, cross-references, and translation verification, produces a document of some length. The oral tradition accounts alone occupied 43 volume equivalents. The xenology files on the Keth, assembled over 312 years of research, occupied another 31. The translation project records, including all working documents and revision histories, occupied 97. The legal drafting history, with the 40-year progression from first draft to framework certified final version, occupied 22. The Framework Authorization Panel had reviewed the entire docket 407 years ago when the claim was filed. They had reviewed it again, at their standard claim maintenance interval, at the 100-year mark, the 200-year mark, and the 300-year mark. They had certified its completeness each time. The panel members who had done the last review, 300 years in, were 8 generations removed from the ones who had done the first. The chain had held in the framework too, not just in the archive. I read the founding brief every time. Not because I was required to. The review protocol required only that the current operational parameters be certified, not that the entire historical record be read from the beginning. I read it because I believed it mattered to understand where the chain had started. To understand what had been asked of the people who started it, who had been asked to build something they would not live to see used, for a purpose whose timeline they could not predict, on behalf of people who had been taken so long ago that their names survived only because other people had made it their life's work to preserve them. 3,412 names. I had read each of them too. That also was not required. That was something I did on my own time, in the evenings during the 9-day review, working through the oral tradition compilation, reading the names aloud in the empty duty room. Some of them were full names, preserved in remarkable completeness. Some of them were partial names, or names as rendered in translation from a language that no longer existed in the form it had once taken. Some of them were descriptive names, given by the accounts that remembered a person but could not recover what that person had been called: the woman with the gray braid from the North Camp, the boy who kept the fire records, the elder who argued with the hunters and was taken first. They had been people. They had been real. They had been part of the world that the Keth had assessed and sorted and reduced to utility index scores. The archive had built the case so that they would not be reduced to utility index scores forever. I told you that I felt completion when the engagement ran. Let me try to be more precise. What I felt was not the completion of something I had done. I had been at the garrison for 11 years, which was nothing compared to the 400 years since the docket was filed, which was nothing compared to the 182,000 years since Keth Perrin wrote the brief. What I had done was hold the post, check the weapon, execute the authorization when the time came. That is all any individual can do in a chain that long, hold the post. What I felt was the completion of something that a very great, many people had done across a very long time, and I happened to be the one standing at the wall when it finished. I have thought since about what that means, about whether it is strange to feel completed by an action you did not personally build toward, one that was built toward for 200,000 years before you were born. I have decided it is not strange. The chain is the thing. The individual links do not build the chain by themselves. They hold their section and pass it forward. My grandmother's grandmother had held her section in the oral tradition division. Working on accounts she would never see enter the legal record, because the legal division would not be funded for another 60,000 years after her death. The translators who decoded the Keth hierarchical address had held their section for 3 generations, building a grammar from degraded recordings of a language no one alive had ever heard spoken in full. The legal drafters who spent 40 years producing a claim in that language had held their section without knowing when or whether their client, humanity, collectively, across 200 millennia, would ever have the standing to use it. They all held, the chain held. That was what I felt completing. There is one more thing I want to say, and it is about the silence after. When the engagement ended and the engagement timer stopped, and I walked to the center of the garrison wall and looked out over the plateau, there was a stillness that I have not been able to fully describe to anyone who was not there. Not silence in the acoustic sense. The wind was still blowing. The megacity hummed below. The ring's transit drives were audible at very low frequency if you knew what to listen for. But a stillness underneath those sounds, a quality to the air that felt like the space left by the ending of something that had been running for a very long time. A tension released. Not my tension or the garrison's tension, though we had held those too, something older than that. The tension that had been in the land of this plateau for 200,000 years, since the first people had looked up and seen the lights descending and had not known what they were. A thing that had been held and braced against for 200 millennia, the fact of what had been done here, and the fact of its possibility returning had been resolved. The case was closed. The record was complete. The names were in the Foundation files. The plateau would not be the same place it had been before the spring morning the Keth landed, but it would be a different kind of place than it had been for the previous 200,000 years. It would be a place where the thing that had been done was in the record, and the people who had been taken were in the record, and the ending was in the record, and anyone who wanted to know what had happened could go to the archive and read it from the beginning. The archive kept everything. That was, in the end, the heart of it, not the ring, not the 41,000 warships, not the kinetic arrays or the 9,000 rapid response vessels or the 11-minute engagement time. Those were all real, and they mattered, and without them the docket would have been a document without an arm behind it. But the heart of what humanity had built in those 200,000 years was not the force. It was the record. Because the force could be matched, in theory, by any civilization with sufficient time and resources. There is nothing unique about mass or energy or orbital mechanics. What was unique, what the Keth had not understood was possible, because they had not believed the prey could ever become something that would trouble to do it, was the decision to remember, to build an institution around remembering, to fund it and staff it and maintain it across every era of political change, and every generation of new priorities, and every temptation to say that the threat was probably mythological, and the money could be better used. Keth Perrin had understood something that the Keth ascendancy had not. She had understood that the measure of a civilization was not only what it could build. It was what it chose to remember, and what it was willing to build in service of that memory. Humanity had chosen to remember 3,412 names. The Keth had not thought that was possible. They should have.